Today we're going to talk about the economics of grain sorghum. Several factors in there why we want to consider grain sorghum. One, of course, it does have more drought tolerance, and so if we get into those dry years, there's certainly an advantage to grain sorghum. Another thing is that there's less production cost in it. The biggest difference in producing grain sorghum as corn is a lower seed cost with grain sorghum. So that's one thing we kind of keep in mind as we go through the presentation here. One of the things is kind of thinking back here, like conditions to the 80s, when we had some tough times. One of the guys I knew well, his dad owned a lumber yard in Iowa. And he said all those years, farmers always came in the wintertime and purchased fencing supplies and so forth. But when we had those tough times in the 80s, they didn't even come in those years. And I know Mick Hellberg, who was the former Hays County Extension agent, he talked about some of the tough times that in Hays County during those 80s and so forth. And he talked about they had a lot of staple straighteners those years, that the people didn't even come in and buy staples and so forth to fix their fence. So they was trying to really keep down cost. One of the things is we started the ecofallow program on growing sorghum way back in the 70s and so forth. This is in Furnace County. And we had a conventional field where they tilled the ground and so forth and planted grain sorghum. And then in the background, you see ecofallow sorghum. In other words, that was no-till into winter wheat stubble. The one in the foreground basically yielded 0. And we had, as you look here, 100 bushel plus grain sorghum in that no-till field, planted into winter wheat stubble, which was not tilled but sprayed with herbicides to control weeds. Really showed us some of the big advantages way back then in the early 70s of no-till in southwest Nebraska. And of course, one of the big factors was the amount of residue that really made a difference between successfully growing that grain sorghum crop during a pretty dry year. Some work we did in Red Willow County in 2003, we had corn and grain sorghum fields side by side. And in a test we had there, we had slightly over 91 bushel for corn. And right in the sorghum there, we had 97 bushel. Not too bad a year for producing the corn and grain sorghum dry land in Red Willow County. This is some work from the Rogers Farm east of Lincoln that Paul Yassa did, showing the advantage of no-till soybeans. And there was about 11 bushel advantage there on no-till soybeans. When we got over to the grain sorghum no-till, there was about a 14 bushel advantage over conventional and so forth. And one thing that Paul noticed there is one crop cultivation. Of course, that reduces the water supply by 1/3 to 1/2 inch. Costs grain sorghum yields about 4 bushel per acre just by going in using the cultivator one time. Some work the Arapaho Co-op did then during that same time. Their best yields were like with ecofallow and no-till. And then as you got down to conventional, they gave up quite a bit, both in returns and yields. And one of the things is when we were back then in that time, we didn't have glyphosate to control the volunteer wheat. So we used paraquat and so forth. And we had a lot of farmers that wanted to undercut instead of using a burn down with their atrazine to control the weeds. Well, one of the things we found out, it cost them about 5 bushel per acre, which was more than adequate to pay for the additional cost of the paraquat, so they didn't have to do the undercutting. So just showed you some advantages even way back then of using herbicides to control weeds rather than tillage. There's 3 characteristics of sorghum that give it potential advantage over corn in dry areas and so forth. And one, of course, is corn is cross-pollinated, where sorghum is self-pollinated and produces heads over a longer period of time because tillers develop over several weeks. And consequently, short periods of drought do not affect the grain sorghum as much as they do corn because of that longer period of time developing interiors and tillers and so forth. Another advantage, of course, is the optimum relationship between plant population and moisture supply is more critical with corn. Sorghum's a little bit more forgiving and so forth. And we look at this next slide, we really see that. We'll only pay attention to the solid thing because we're not discussing the corn thing in the skip row. But if you go to the left side of the slide, you'll see where we planted 10,000. This was a pretty dry year at Trenton, Nebraska. 57 bushel. At 15,000, we had 57 bushel too. But when we planted 20,000 that year and had a pretty dry year, the yield was only 44 bushel. So we gave up quite a few bushel by going to that higher plant population and so forth. And so it is more critical if you get too high a plant population with corn during those dry years. Sorghum's more forgiving on that. And then the third thing is sorghum foliage resist drying and so forth. At equal moisture stress, corn leaves lose a greater percentage of water content than do sorghum leaves. The waxy coating on sorghum leaves and stems may be an important cause. And this coating often gives the leaf shield a sticky, frosty appearance. This is some work out of South Central and so forth that's really pretty interesting over a number of years. And as we go back in 1997, the top line there in Nuckolls County, and we look at the average on the grain sorghum yields, it's about 107.7 bushel. Corn on the average that year was 79.9. Then we see that sorghum corn advantage, the second row from the right, and about 28 bushel difference. And then we can look at the May through September rainfall, which is, of course, very critical growing period of time, about 16.5. If we stay over in that column and look at 98 in Webster County, about a 20 bushel advantage on the grain sorghum. And you can see it was fairly dry that year, about 12.5 inches. Going to 99 in Nuckolls County, another about 20 bushels per acre, and the rainfall about 20 inches and so forth. Look at 2000 in Nuckolls County and so forth. There was only 3.9 bushels difference between corn and grain sorghum. These have all been in favor of the grain sorghum yields and so forth, but in 19.5 inches. In Webster County that year in 2001, where they were comparing grain sorghum and corn, and 24 inches of precip from May to September. And of course, you'd expect the corn to outshine the sorghum in that kind of situations. And the difference in yield was 2.5 bushels less for grain sorghum that year and so forth. Now, conversely, we never know what the weather's going to do in Nebraska. And the 2002, everybody remembers that as being a pretty dry year. And the grain sorghum yield that year was 63.3 bushel on the average and so forth. And the average corn yield, and that was only 13.6, or almost a 50 bushel advantage to the grain sorghum. And of course, this is where grain sorghum really shines, is when you get those dry years. And the May through September rainfall that year was only 7 inches and so forth. So you see quite an advantage on that. If you total them all up, basically about a 20 bushel advantage to the grain sorghum. over the corn. And we always say grain sorghum is bringing a little bit less on price, and that yield advantage is always great enough in most dry years in Nebraska to more than compensate for that reduced price of grain sorghum as compared to corn. We look at the response to water and so forth, and on grain sorghum, this is the solid line on the left there. Start getting some yield when we get about 7 inches of ET. And likewise with corn, we're probably talking about 11 inches of ET. Now this is really interesting. This has taken some work out of South Central area and Southeast area on sorghum and corn. And you can see how those lines really, or those yields actually fit those lines really good. So this response line, I think, is pretty typical there that you get. And basically it shows when you get up to about 21 inches, you get about 170 bushel in there. And that's where the corn and the grain sorghum lines cross there at about 21 inches of ET. But the responses, it's kind of interesting looking at those over the years in a couple of different locations, how well the production fit those ET lines. And again, we'll say it takes about 7 inches of ET before we get the sorghum, and then the response is about 9.4 bushel. Corn takes a little bit more ET before we get that push bushel, but corn does respond at a higher grain per inch of ET, about 13.3. Now, weed management is always important and so forth, and I always remember this. We had a test plot in this particular field, and every 6 rows, there was a row of foxtail in the plots and so forth. And people always want to blame that on bad application and so forth, maybe a nozzle plug and so forth. What that really was the farmer had a 6-row planter, and this was the marking system, planting the weed seed. So you won't have near as many weeds if you don't plant the seed and so forth out there. Just shows you an advantage of good weed management by not planting the weed seeds and so forth. This is an interesting one. You see the patches of weeds out there in the corn. And what was interesting about that particular and why this happened is that when they harvested the wheat, and they had 60, 70 bushel wheat, a good wheat crop, but they didn't spread the residue. So behind the combine in that area where they didn't spread the residue out, we estimated there was probably 13 to 14,000 pounds of wheat residue out there, which almost is impossible to plant through that much wheat residue. So the farmer realized that, and so he went out and dissed the field one time, which basically reduces the amount of residue in about half. So they ended up with probably 6,000 to 7,000 pounds of residue behind the combine and almost nothing in between there. And that's where the weeds are at. Now, as we look at the next thing, and this is a close-up view showing how bad those weeds are, but if we look at the response here to thousands of weeds and the straw level, we really see those functions on what happened in that field. And you look at the top line in there, and kind of a red or light red, looking at that, you can see with no herbicide and no residue out there, we had about 125,000 weeds per acre and so forth. When we got all the way over to 6,000 pounds of residue, which would be about the residue from 60 bushel wheat crop, we had about 1/5 as many weeds. But the important part here is what responds on the herbicide that we put in. And the yellow line here shows you that with no residue out there, we had about 50,000 weeds per acre. But when we started getting a little residue out there, it greatly decreased decrease the population of weeds when, of course, we had the herbicide out there. Now, that's what really happened in the field, where he still had good amounts of residue behind the combine. He had good weed control, but in between the areas where there was no residue, basically, his weed management program wasn't good enough where he didn't have some residue, and that's why the weeds in that area. And so he had a big stand of weeds in that with no residue. His herbicide program wasn't good enough, but where he had good residue, that 7,000 pounds of residue, even after the disking, he had good weed control. So you always want to manage those weeds. An important part of it is maintaining good residue and spreading the residue with the combine, very important at harvest time. Now we want to look at a little bit on some economics and so forth. We put together these budgets for 2017. This is one conventional grain sorghum and so forth. We always put a yield goal in there. In this particular case, 105 bushel, and then we usually discount it a little bit, 95 bushel actual yield. The reason we put the yield goal in there is that's what we base our recommendations for seeding rate, fertilizer, and those kinds of things and so forth. But we usually reduce it a little bit, weather conditions and so forth, maybe some diseases or insects that we didn't get controlled or weeds that we didn't do the best job on controlling. So we usually put in an actual yield a little bit lower. As we go through this, and you can go on the web and look at these individual budgets and see how you compare on those. But as we get down here to the bottom, towards the bottom, we got the cost per bushel at about $3.35 with today's cost inputs. And then as we just look at the cash cost, we're looking at about $2.12. Now we look at corn cost per bushel, it's quite a bit higher, about $5.52 versus the sorghum, $3.35. And if we look at the cash cost, it's about $1 more, $3.10 versus $2.12. So quite a little advantage here to the grain sorghum over the corn. Now, as we look at the no-till systems and so forth, and we go down through here, and again, you can go and look at detail on those on the crop budgets on the web. And going down here with our various treatments, we try to break it down so you can go in and compare your cost and see how it matches up to ours. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later here. But as we go down to the final line here, we're looking on grain sorghum about $3.18, a cash cost a little bit less than $2, about $1.94. And then if we look at corn in comparison, we're almost $1 more on the total cost, and the cash cost probably right around 50 cents and so forth, an advantage again to the grain sorghum. Now let's look at the ecofallow system, and of course that's a real popular system, is planting no-till into winter wheat stubble that was harvested the previous season and so forth. We go down here and look at the cash cost and so forth and total cost for grain sorghum. We're probably here at $3.05 per bushel, and then our cash cost looking at about $2.10 and so forth. Again, an advantage to grain sorghum. It comes a little bit closer here because corn does a little bit better in the ecofallow system because we do a better job of conserving soil water and that with a good residue from winter wheat, and reduces the evaporation loss, so it gives more water for the corn, so it's a little bit less in cost difference between those. But we're still looking at advantage of total cost, almost 50 cents a difference. And if we look at the cash cost, we got $2.10 on grain sorghum and about $2.35 on corn. And then this is some no-till, limited irrigation, so forth that we've got. And you can go down here. We don't have the comparison in here for corn, but this looking at about $1.93 cash cost per bushel on grain sorghum. Now, one of the things that you can do is compare your expenses, and this is one of the things we recommend people do, is look at our budgets and then compare their cost to those. This can really help you, especially during these tough times that we have now and low commodity prices. But a good source of information too in comparison was going in and looking at Nebraska Farm Business, and the last one that was available at the time we did this was the 2015. But we just wanted to look at here irrigated soybeans on share rented land, and we got the average of all farms here. And if you looked at the high cost producers here, they were almost $17.56 here for cost per bushel on the high cost producers, the high 1/3. The low cost producers were about half that, at about $9.81 and so forth. Really made a difference. Now, we kind of want to look at seeing what is not making that big difference between the high cost producers and the low cost producers. And of course, that's the way you want to use our budgets and so forth to compare your cost. And if you find any cost where you're exceeding the highest compared to those, you'll want to work on those areas and find out the reason you're so much higher. One thing we did here was compare yields, and the average yield was about 70 bushel here. The average of the high cost producers, about 69 bushel, and it was about 3 bushel better, about 72 bushel for the low cost producers. And so not much difference on yield, only 3 bushel. Let's look at fertilizer costs to see if there's any difference. The high cost producer was spending almost $70 an acre for fertilizer. Lowest cost producer was about $16.47. So considerably difference between those two. We actually found 3 areas where there was a lot of difference between the high cost producer and the low cost producer, and fertilizer was one, and you can see a pretty big difference between those two, those items there. Another one was machinery cost. The high cost producers you see here, $141.93. The low cost producer was a little bit less than $60, $59.44. So a great big difference in machinery cost. This is an area that producers and the high cost producers need to work on. They might look at custom work or some of these things to reduce this cost, because there's almost, not too far from $100 per acre difference in that cost, and that'll make a big difference in your bottom line on your machinery cost. The other area that we found that there was a lot of difference was hired labor. The cost for the low cost producer on hired labor was just about $10.64, where the high cost producer was $59.42. And these 3 items really made the big difference between the high cost producer and the low cost producer. It was surprisingly how much the other items were pretty much the same. Yield was pretty much the same, but the fertilizer cost, machinery cost, and hired labor really stood out. And so you want to look at some of those items and see how your costs are comparing to like what's in our 2017 budgets. Some things too to always be aware of is there's a lot of generics, pesticides out there now. I know in 2016 we had sprayed for stripe rust in our winter wheat, and I used one of the generics that just costs $1.49 an acre, which really did us a good job. There's fungicides out there that cost almost $20 an acre. And now if you have head smut, that's a different thing. You have to use the higher priced fungicides. But for stripe rust and leaf rust and so forth, many times we can get by with those low cost genetics and so forth. A good reference for this information is the 2017 Guide for Weed, Diseases, and Insect Management in Nebraska. And it lists all the tables on what controls what, and we even have prices in there for estimated prices for 2017. A real good guide for you there. We looked at some rotation differences, and we won't spend a lot of time on this slide, but we gave all the credit here, and this is back from some of our tough times in the 80s, and we gave all the credit to the soybeans here, and it reduced our soybean costs quite a bit. So there's a real advantage in the crop rotation of using the corn soybean rotation as well as compared to continuous corn. So look at some of those rotations to help us. One thing too, a good soil testing program is really valuable, and then paying attention to those recommendations. This is some stuff we did in Nebraska for a number of years, from 74 to 84. And if you just went on the maintenance approach on corn yields and so forth, and put that on at North Platte and Meade, in those years, we produced a total of 3,715 bushel. In using our recommendations from the university on more of a sufficiency approach, in other words, based according to soil test and putting on, we produced 3,662 bushel in that same period of time. We did produce a few more bushels using the maintenance approach. We produced 53 more bushel in those years, but it cost us, if you look over into the columns on the right, cost us $639 more, or if corn was $12.06, the maintenance would have been a good thing. And of course, it's a long way short of that. So the sufficiency approach, or using our University of Nebraska recommendations for fertilizer rates and corn yields, would pay off big dividends, as you can see. So get those good soil samples and then follow, I'd say, the University of Nebraska recommendations to be most economical. And there's a lot of other guides that can help you a lot here. This is on surviving high input costs in crop production. A number of these things are on the web, and go in the Crop Watch, easy way to find all these things on your computer. Thank you.